All right, it's 12 o'clock on Wednesday, 12 o'clock Central Time for 1 o'clock for Tim. So, welcome to the Iowa Learning Farms Conservation Webinar Series. I'm Matt Helmers with Iowa State University, and so get the great pleasure to help moderate the webinars and super excited for the webinar today. We have Tim Rosen, that's the Director of Agriculture and Restoration at Shore Rivers out on the East Coast. I've known Tim for a few years now, and just a little over a year ago, got to visit some of the sites where they'd been working out in Delmarva Peninsula. Um, if you haven't been out there, I'd encourage you to do so. It was a great trip out there. And so Tim's going to talk to us today about pay for performance, cost share alternative to increase non-point source pollution control. As always, if you have questions, please type those in the chat box and I'll get those to Tim at the end of his talk. With that, Tim, the virtual floor is all yours.
Thank you. Thanks for that introduction, Matt. I'm excited to talk to you all about some pay for performance we're doing here in the Chesapeake Bay region. I know it's somewhat of a hot topic coast to coast. There's various models we see for different outcomes. As Matt said, I'm the Director of Agriculture and Restoration from Shore Rivers. Here's my title slide for this. I like to give this to just kind of give a brief glimpse at what we're dealing with here on the Eastern Shore of Maryland and Delaware. It's a very similar landscape to what you see out in the Midwest of our drain landscapes. And my caveat here, you see the title, and in the very far right corner, I put the caveat of maybe increasing non-point source pollution reduction. A brief background on Shore Rivers. We're a nonprofit with a mission and vision to protect and restore Eastern Shore waterways through science-based advocacy, restoration, and education. We do that with a staff of 31 currently. We have 5 departments that are represented by riverkeepers, education, outreach, development. And as Matt said, I'm the Director of Agriculture and Restoration. So within my capacity, our real bread and butter has always been working at the landscape scale with our farmers to implement pollution reduction projects. And this is a good example of us doing that. And this is a field in Maryland where we're doing not only improved drainage into the field, but we're doing a large treatment wetland on the edge of field. This project also had a grass waterway installed as a part of it. And we also incorporated research. And that's a fairly common approach we do here with our projects, is try to be as comprehensive as possible. That usually includes a lot of different financial mechanisms to move these projects forward. And in doing that, we've been fairly successful. This gives you an idea of the watersheds where we're working. Down the middle of this in the gray is the main stem Chesapeake Bay. We really focus on 4 sub-watersheds to the Chesapeake Bay. That includes the Sassafras / Bayside Creeks watersheds, the Chester River, Eastern Bay, the Miles Y River, which is a sub-watershed, and then the largest is the Chop Tank. And since 2015, we've implemented approximately or exactly 287 projects. All of those have nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment reductions associated with them. And this has accumulated an investment in this region, this small region here, of approximately $24 million to implement those 287 projects. So all of these, since 2015, I've been working here since 2012 now. So it's over a decade doing this. Use various financial mechanisms, but the traditional way that we've been doing most of this work are through our cost share programs or grant programs. And to get everyone on the same footing, I'll briefly go through what these different kind of programmatic things exactly entail. Most people who do federal programs understand or have been a part of the Environmental Quality Incentives Program. The goal with that is to usually cover approximately 75% of the costs of that project. Those 75% costs are based off of practice scenarios that give you 100% cost. And then they have payment schedules that allow you to understand what you're being paid for that practice that usually is supposed to cover 75% of the cost. In the state of Maryland, we have our own state-run cost share program, the Maryland Agricultural Water Quality Cost Share Program, where we try to cover 87.5% to 100% of what we call a flat rate cost. And the flat rate costs are generated from a regional average of contractor costs to do that practice. And both of these programs, in the traditional way, is it's been landowner initiated. Usually that landowner goes into that district office and says, I have this resource concern. And then they detail what practices and payments might work for that resource concern. So, for the past few decades, we're paying for practices, and that limits flexibility because you have to meet a certain practice standard or scenario. And the projects, all of these work generally in a reimbursable fashion. The other side of this are grant programs, and that's different. It's not landowner initiated. Usually grant programs are more partnership initiated to achieve a certain goal of implementation. So there's greater flexibility because that partnership's dictating how those projects are selected and funded, but you're always limited by your period of performance. So you can only do a grant, usually we have between 1 and 3 years to execute a grant for implementation. And then after that, the fund is dry and you're back to relying on cost share programs, or if you're effective in administering your grant program, hopefully you influenced that the state or federal government procedures and you have more funding through a different program that they might administer. But as always, you're limited by that period of performance. The difference here is when we do implementation through grants, we usually can either get paid in advance for a portion of the project or paid during the projects being installed. And obviously some of this is also reimbursable after invoices are sent in. An example of this, I just showed a wetland project here that we did recently. That went through both our state cost share program as well as a grant program to install the 7 acres of wetlands. And both of these have processes of funding for planning, design, and implementation. And a lot of times those are discrete processes that take time to execute in order to do that project. So that's the traditional way. And recently, we examined what's happening in the Bay. Obviously, we've kind of are the poster child for total maximum daily loads and implementing nutrient reduction. And we're getting close to when we're supposed to achieve those goals, which was 2025. And we know we are coming up short. So the Scientific and Technical Advisory Committee, the Chesapeake Bay program, did a deep dive and examined why the Chesapeake Bay is not achieving those water quality goals. So they came out with this report, a comprehensive evaluation of system response, which we all call CSER, to really understand, what's limiting us from achieving these goals, and do we have to refocus on ways to achieve those goals? And kind of distilling that report down, we have an understanding that most of the pollution is coming from very targeted regions within our watershed. Nonpoint source is still the biggest obstacle for us to achieve our goals. We need more monitoring to better improve our modeling. There's a huge imbalance in nutrients across the watershed, and we can't really keep up with those with the practices we're implementing. And finally, and most importantly, and the reason we're having this talk, is that they found that incentive and voluntary programs are not enough to mitigate pollution sources. So it was pretty damning in that in the direct language from the report, which I've highlighted here, so you know that I'm not making it up. But basically they said that additional funding of existing implementation efforts is unlikely to produce the intended nutrient reduction outcomes. So they were basically pointing to the traditional way of doing things is not going to have us achieve our goals. And then they highlighted here at the bottom that we need to think about new financial mechanisms and programs such as, and they highlighted here, pay for performance and pay for success, that offers opportunities to reward treatment of high loss areas or operations and to encourage adoption of highly effective practices that land managers may not consider under a standard cost share program. So this report really has shifted focus from, the traditional way we funded things to maybe moving towards these pay for success or pay for performance models in order to achieve our nutrient reduction goals. So what is this pay for outcomes, pay for performance model? In a nutshell, it's really you're just getting paid once an outcome or performance metric is verified. And when we talk about what that outcome and performance metrics could be, it could be a lot of different things. Traditionally, and what a lot of people talk about is the carbon markets, carbon sequestration. You're getting paid for that, pound, ton, or whatever carbon being sequestered by doing that practice. In the Bay region, instead of carbon, we look at pounds of nitrogen or phosphorus reduced as a potential way of doing that outcome. But it could also be performance metrics. It could be acres of a practice implemented. So acres of wetlands, acres of black duck habitat. These could also be performance metrics of milestones. A certain monitoring milestone, a permitting milestone could be a pay for performance program or model. Verification in itself could take different forms. I guess the best way is direct monitoring, but direct monitoring is not always feasible. And a lot of times across large landscapes, it's not feasible just because of how much financing it might take to do that direct monitoring. So on the other hand, we do modeling. And those models need to be approved models based off of expert panels that have said that, in this region, you doing this practice, there's this certain amount of reduction that's to be expected. And for us, we have the Chesapeake Bay model that has all of the different approved best management practices in it with different reduction parameters. And we have a tool called the Chesapeake Assessment Scenario Tool that we're able to say, if I implement, say, drainage water management in the Sassafras watershed, I expect to reduce nitrogen by X amount by doing that project. And finally, verification, another way of doing it is submission of just management documentation. Obviously, the management of that project is how you verify that you're making those reductions. So there's different ways that verification can be done for these models. And for contracts, I've seen everything from annual, and the longest contract that I'm a part of is a 20-year contract for a practice. Some of the benefits, you're shifting risk from the state to the implementer because they're not going to get paid until verification is completed. Can be comprehensive. So as I said before, I go through potentially 3-step process through grants or programs to do one project. Well, now I'm not going through that process because with pay for performance, I'm self-financing all aspects to get that project implemented. So I'm consolidating all of those steps into one step that I'm self-financing. I can aggregate more projects on a farm field or across a region. And in addition to this, in order to get that practice moving forward, I can create incentive packages for that landowner to be interested in doing that practice. So it really gives you flexibility in order to get that project put into the ground. And finally, generally speaking, you assume the outcomes are potentially real when you're doing monitoring and modeling. It's more based off of that model's reality that everyone has agreed upon. And obviously, if you're targeting the most cost effective within that program, you're going to be cost effective, like dollars per pound of nitrogen. It's going to be much more targeted just because that's how you get to that, that most cost effective practice. So hopefully I haven't lost anyone yet, because I'm definitely going to lose you now on these next slides. And that gets into the payment schedules when we work with pay for performance models. The purest model, I always say, is an outcome made is an outcome paid. I'm contracted to reduce 400 pounds of nitrogen per year by implementing this project. My contract says that's 1,200 pounds of the contract length, and I've come to an agreement with that buyer at $10 per pound per year. So this is a uniform payment schedule, and it works really well with an annual practice. So if I do, say, 10 acres of cover crop, my model says that's when I implement 10 acres every year, that's 400 pounds reduced. It's, with those annual practices, I have a known amount of capital I'm investing every year to do that practice. So when I get to that dollars per pound, it's pretty straightforward. So it works really well. This sort of model works really well for an annual practice where we know direct capital outlays every year. When we get to projects that are much more structural, large scale, comprehensive, We're investing a lot more capital, not on an annual basis, but on a front end, right? To get to that first pound of nitrogen or phosphorus reduced could be a few $1,000,000, right? So instead of doing that direct outcome made, outcome paid, some models here, and this is done a lot in mitigation work across the country, are milestone based. So in year one, when I completed my project, showed as built, and verified the project was built per spec, that program might disperse 75% of the funding. And that's gets to the basis of that investors put up. I'm using small numbers in my slide here, but that investor could have put up, tens of millions of dollars to get to that as built with that nutrient reduced. So instead of just putting it purely based on the outcome of pounds, in this case, this outcome is a milestone, and that's the as built milestone. So 75% dispersed the first year, and by year three, in this instance, I'm using kind of the permit as the milestones. So the permit in and of itself say, you have 3 years of monitoring or 5 years of monitoring. So halfway through, I might get another 10% dispersed after showing monitoring and the project's being effective. And then at closeout, I get the remainder fund, which is a slightly higher percent of the total, just to ensure that I am going to be held to that contract length and don't leave that project early. So 15% at final payment. This can also work if you're looking at a, say, nitrogen outcome. So instead of looking at a percent of that total cost, and I apologize, my slide here should not say percent of total for the middle, it should be dollars per pound. What I'm changing here is the cost per pound per year in that contract. So I'm still reducing 400 pounds per year, like my very first example, but if you want to buy this from me, my cost in that first year is $22.50 per pound. And as the implementer or investor in this project, what I'm saying to the person buying this outcome is that I've invested, a substantial amount of money to produce this nitrogen outcome in the first year. So I think it has much higher value. And if you want to buy it from me, you're gonna have to pay a higher price. But by year 2 and 3, I don't have the same kind of value for that nitrogen outcome because I'm doing monitoring and maintenance. And if I built that project correctly, it should be functioning fine through the next few years. So that value of nitrogen is lower. It goes from $3 to, in the last year, I'm holding back a little bit more to reduce risk to the buyer, to say that I'm going to be held to this contract period longer or through the whole contract period. So I'll agree to pay a higher price for that nitrogen, holding back my financing more to the final year. But when you look at this in aggregate, in the end, the buyer's still averaging out at $10 per pound of nitrogen. It's just in a non-uniform fashion that is being paid out. So that's another way of looking at this for our large structural projects, where we need to balance the financing to get that project installed, ensure that we're not over-financing a project over a contract period, and providing the most cost-effective dollars per pound. And now that I've confused everyone, I want to confuse you one step more, is that we've been working with state and federal agencies that don't view what I've just showed here, this example, this variable cost per pound, but they view it as, we want to see a flat rate, a flat $10 per pound payment rate in your contract. What you'll vary is that we are more or less prepaying for credits. So instead of agreeing to a higher cost for that credit in the first year, but still delivering that 400 pounds in the first year, what they're saying is, well, we're paying you for 900 pounds. We want to keep the rate the same, but we're prepaying for credits. That's another way of looking at this. Some of the issues with this is the other model where you have that variable cost per pound. That could be a fairly straightforward contract because you're agreeing to those costs. In this instance, if in year 2, I verify a lower pounds, if I'm under that 400 pounds in year 2, basically the purchaser or the state that's purchasing it is going to have to use a vehicle to have me pay back a certain amount of money. So that program has become more complex. And that's an issue we've been facing with some of these state and also federal view of how they're buying credits, is they're viewing it in this fashion where they're prepaying rather than understanding it as paying for a different value of that credit. I could go into so much more detail on that, and I probably confused everyone already. but for the sake of time, I'm going to keep moving along here. So that's just a very short and confusing way of how those pay for performance models work. So in the state of Maryland, how is this working? We have a lot of state funding to do conservation work, which is great. This started with some of this through the Bay Restoration Fund. This was established in 2004 in order to update all of our wastewater treatment plants with ENR technology to be the highest performance plants basically in the world. We have the most high-tech wastewater treatment systems anywhere. So this fund has upgraded 65 of our 67 wastewater treatment plants across the state. And the last two, one is in construction, one is finalizing design. So we're basically done upgrading all of our wastewater treatment plants to the latest technology. This fund is also used for septic system upgrades, as well as funding our cover crop program, which many people know about. It's one of the most effective cover crop programs administered across the country. We approximately get 40% of our acres covered in cover crops every year. And the Bay Restoration Fund pays half, and another fund pays half into that. In total, since 2004, this fund has administered about $2 billion. Since we've been so effective of getting our wastewater treatment plants upgraded, legislation was enacted in 2017 to authorize the Bay Restoration Fund to purchase cost-effective nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment reductions. And that was a kind of a test program that went from 17 to 21 with varying amounts of money going towards it. The big thing here was they could not purchase from the ag sector. It was really geared to urban stormwater as the only sector they wanted to buy those credits from. This changed in 2021. So they amended that Clean Water Commerce Act, and they created a Clean Water Commerce account. So from that Bay Restoration Fund, every year $20 million is put into that account where they're buying the most cost-effective nitrogen reduction credits. And 35% of this is purely for the purchase of outcomes from the ag sector. 20% is dedicated to environmental justice projects, and then 10% of it is from non-ag. The remainder fund can go to any sector to purchase credits from. So it could be ag, could be urban. This program ranks projects. So they kind of use the interesting format to ensure that there's also co-benefits, just not the nitrogen reduction. So obviously, because it is for nitrogen reduction, you get 60 points for being the most cost-effective at reducing nitrogen. And then there's 40 additional points for different co-benefits. 10 points for mitigation and climate resilience. And generally, we're quantifying that using Comet Planner to demonstrate carbon sequestration. 10 points of alleviating environmental harms in communities disproportionately burdened by those environmental harms. 10 points for local water quality standards. 5 points, and this is a sliding scale of 1 to 5 points for phosphorus reductions, as well as 1 to 5 points for sediment reduction. And then finally 10 points, and they called out 2 practice categories of natural filters, which are wetlands, buffers, tree plantings, as well as something that we worked on was the inclusion of conservation drainage practices. So you get 10 points for bioreactors, drainage water management, saturated buffers. So those were called out specifically because we have a pretty large goal in the state to increase conservation drainage implementation by roughly 18,000 acres. So looking at this for the first round, there was 36 applications that requested roughly $90 million in aggregate from that $20 million that they had. The most cost-effective project came in at $16.31 per pound of nitrogen. The max request was over $1,500 per pound of nitrogen. And looking at all of those 36 applications, they averaged out to $183 per pound. When we look at projects selected from all sectors, the average was $65.26 a pound of nitrogen. And then when you look at agriculture, it was even more cost effective. So from the ag projects, it was $27.38 pounds of N. That represented about 722,000 pounds of nitrogen reduced across those contract lengths. And at the state level, the cost effectiveness number is about $150 per pound of nitrogen reduced. So when we look at this, they hit their cost effectiveness limit. And obviously on the ag side, we were even more cost effective. Perfect scores, 2 projects received 100 points, so they got perfect scores. And because this program is not really self-limiting in what kind of project type, so the project type does have to be an accredited BMP within the Chesapeake Bay program, but it can be almost any. So the projects range from farm scale restoration that include stream restoration, wetland restoration, and buffer installation, all in one request, as well as drainage water management. There were living shorelines, there were urban bioretentions. One applicant did advanced nutrient management in their application, as well as alternative crop. One project was, I believe, I didn't work on this project, so I don't know specifically, but I'm fairly certain it was a miscanthus project for alternative crop in a field. So the great thing about these pay for performance models is that if you're geared to that nitrogen outcome, you're not self-selecting or whittling down what can be implemented. You're really looking at the most cost-effective and targeted nitrogen reduction. So you saw this nice kind of spectrum of projects being implemented. So within the Bay, within the state of Maryland, what are we looking into the future? I say what is or was next, because we've been doing a lot of this over the past couple of years. In 2022, the state wanted to codify in law the ability for pay for success contracts as a way for any agency to contract under state procurement. So any agency now, the state is able to do pay for success contracts, and they can define what kind of outcome they're paying for. And they provide a definition of environmental outcome that is rather, I guess you could say, almost ambiguous. It could be almost anything that the agency wants to quantify in a single and quantifiable and certified unit. And they provide here, some kind of guardrails, but really it gives a lot of leeway to those agencies to define how they want to define that outcome that they're paying for. The Conservation Finance Act was much more comprehensive than just the pay for success. It also defined what is blue and green infrastructure. And it also opened up financing of conservation to be at the same level as gray infrastructure under state law. So it provided us access to low interest loans for this kind of stuff. And it's really opened up ways we could do conservation work outside the confines of the traditional cost share or grant methods. And the first program that was administered through the Conservation Finance Act, or I guess you'd say not through, but allowed through because of the change in legislation, was the Conowingo Dam Pay for Success. So the Conowingo Dam is the most downstream dam on the Susquehanna River. And the Susquehanna River is the largest nutrient sediment and phosphorus load source to the Chesapeake Bay. So they have their own, what we call watershed implementation plan to help clean up that portion of the Susquehanna. So in order to accelerate that cleanup effort through their watershed implementation plan, they have a dedicated fund of $25 million to purchase verified nitrogen outcomes. And this was all due to the Conservation Finance Act allowing for, in this instance, the Maryland Department of Environment, working with the Susquehanna River Basin Commission to put this program together. So it's really starting to open the doors for other state agencies to look into how they can determine what outcomes they want to achieve outside of even nitrogen. It could be habitat acres from Maryland Department of Natural Resources. And there's been a lot of different ways that these agencies are looking into reshaping their grant programs to use this and leverage other state funds to achieve these conservation goals. So with that, I'm gonna kind of leave it there. We're excited about these pay for performance, pay for outcome models to accelerate conservation. And we need to understand that flexibility needs to be part of this. And we need to work to ensure that our state and federal agencies understand that not every payment method makes sense to achieve different project goals. So excited to see more of this across the country, and I'm happy to answer any questions, and hopefully I haven't confused everyone too much. Thank you.
No, thanks so much, Tim. We do have some questions that have come in. We'll get to those in a second. Maybe we can get to the last couple slides here if they're on the end. So if you are on today and are looking for a CCA CEU, Certified Crop Advisor CEU, if you can email Elena Whitaker, ALENAW at iastate.edu by 5 o'clock today. Email your name, the name you entered to watch the webinar, and your CCA number. Again, Elena Whitaker, ALENAW at iastate.edu. If we can go to the next slide. And if you watch this webinar live, you can and are willing to fill out the voluntary demographic survey, we'd greatly appreciate it. You can scan that QR code or go to iowalearningfarms.org/survey. Only one survey response is needed for all 2024 webinars. So if you've done so, thank you very much. If you're willing to, that would be fabulous. We'd greatly appreciate it. And next week we have Sarah Castle from the Department of Natural Resources and Environmental Sciences at the University of Illinois, talking about social ecological suitability of agroforestry in the Midwest. So I think that's it. Oh yeah. One update to the Iowa Learning Farms webinars. You can find those in the normal place. You might go to them for ILF webinar archives, but we were also asked in a recent farmer meeting if we could put those on YouTube, because then they could subscribe to that YouTube channel and just get alerted when any new webinars were updated. So Lena took the lead on getting those webinars uploaded to YouTube. So IA Learning Farms /dash webinars. You can go there. Okay, Tim, we did have some questions. I think you kind of answered this, but I don't know if there's anything else to add. There were a couple questions on who is the buyer in these pay for performance scenarios, or maybe I think you talked a little bit about that, but if you're looking at any other new buyers too.
So in the state of Maryland, it is the state in and of itself that's purchasing the nitrogen reduction outcomes. I'm sure you all are familiar, like the Soil and Water Outcomes Fund across the country now, they have buyers from industry partners. So it could be, industry partners that have certain sustainability goals that want to purchase carbon. So it's various buyers, but for nitrogen, it's really been state driven.
And it might be early, but has there been enough time to determine whether these kind of pay for outcomes-based mechanisms are overcoming some of the barriers that were identified in that Chesapeake Bay report?
Oh, it's probably way too early to tell. I mean, I can tell you that from a targeting perspective, we've had a lot of discussions about how do we better target practices. I'm sure everyone has had that. And one of the biggest issues we have are mapping tools that we use might actually not help us target the best nitrogen reductions, just telling us a region to work in. Whereas when we do these projects, we're able to a lot of times have to do field work to verify certain numbers. So we know those are exact. So from a targeting perspective, I think it'll help us get the most cost effective, but as across the Bay region wide, it's not too early to tell.
Okay. So there was one about, kind of the paying for, or could you clarify the difference between paying for practices versus paying for a modeled outcome? I guess how different is the modeled outcome from the expected result from implementing a practice?
Yeah, so when you're paying for a practice, you're basically, you implement the practice and then as soon as it's done, it's all paid for and done, right? And you might give an operation and maintenance plan to whoever owns that property. When you do pay for performance, in this instance, Shore Rivers gets paid that first year, a certain portion, but I'm contracted now for 10 years to provide verification, depending on what it is. It could be monitoring, direct monitoring. It could be, implementation plan. So for drainage water management, it's on me to ensure that water control structure is managed by the plan every year. And if it's not, I have to tell why we did that. And if it goes so far askew from that plan, say the farmer decided to hide and bury the boards and I can't find them, then I have to say, well, I haven't produced that outcome because when I model this, it's not going to give you this reduced result. So now I lose that payment for that year. So there's a lot more accountability in that system. Whereas if I just pay for that structure in one fell swoop, there might not be that follow through. And we've had
Mm-hmm.
that issue, as we all know, while we're kind of moving towards automation on some things. So that's the difference there.
Yeah, and that kind of gets at somebody asked if there, does a front-loaded non-uniform payment schedule increase the risk of project abandonment? And you kind of talked about the potential if it's all paid for up front in some of our traditional systems that, then there may be project abandonment or they just, kind of don't
So
don't
yeah,
do management in the
and
future.
the traditional system, yeah, you have sometimes you have abandonment depending on the landowner. For a front and loaded contract, that is one of our concerns that we worked through in this legislative session. Actually, we had a deep dive into it. And the way that we're showing is that usually there's enough financial incentive across that contract period that someone doesn't want to step away from that project because generally you're recouping your capital costs in the first few years
Mm-hmm.
and you're not seeing a true return on your investment because when we're doing these models for pay for performance, it's really a return on your investment. There's an incentive for that implementer to do this outside of just paying for that project. So you're not seeing that return on the investment until, year 3, 4, 5 of that contract period. So you're beholden to see that investment through because you're not getting a return until later into that contract. And we had to make sure we balance this because if we do a uniform payment where we're only getting, say, 1/10 of that cost per year, we're causing investors to overfinance a project to recoup costs faster to hit a certain return profile. So we had projects that we've looked at both ways, huge projects, a flat investment portfolio or a flat investment on that project over, say, 20 years calls us to increase financing by 7 million. So at that point, the state is more or less paying for financing to that implementer rather than paying for the direct nitrogen cost. So we're trying to balance that by allowing for these upfront loaded contracts. So we're not overpaying for financing, but there's enough return on that investment across that contract period to keep those investors and implementers, aggregators beholden to follow through.
There was a question if you have a report or other resource that summarizes the material you presented today.
I'm going to point to some of my friends over at the Environmental Policies Innovation Center, EPIC. They have a lot of information on pay for performance models across the country.
Okay.
It might not go into what I've discussed exactly, but they do go into Maryland's programs. They go into programs in North Carolina and other states. So they're pretty exhaustive there, and they're a great resource for this across the country.
There's another one. And what kind of staff time do you think and training is needed to implement this type of, pay for performance versus or pay for outcomes versus a more traditional cost share program?
Oh, staff capacity. The steepest learning curve is understanding the financing. The practices are the same between either kind of method. The biggest part is just understanding the financing and then working with partners who are able to secure the financing. Because these are, in a lot of instances, multi-million-dollar projects that you have to have a partnership team that is able to secure outside financing for, is comfortable with. But you also need to have the staff that are boots on the ground that have those relationships with the farmers to sell that practice and have the ability to say, I'm going to be your friend now for 10 years, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to be on your property doing verification for 10 years.
Yeah.
So the biggest hurdle is just understanding the financing and that aspect of this.
Have the farmers you worked with kind of understood that need for verification and I guess been actively engaged in that?
Yeah, there haven't been. So, I mean, all this is public, so I could say we were contracted on 6 projects this past year. There has not been any hesitation from those farmers because generally what we're trying to do is strike a balance of achieving their goals and needs as well as what we want to implement to reduce that nitrogen. So we have buy-in from them. They were completely clear with them that this is going to be verification. We'll be out in your farm doing certain things at certain times. But we also built those relationships with those farmers over time.
Yeah.
So we're not a new face when we're proposing this.
Okay. So it, it kind of did highlight that um, this is, you mentioned the analysis on the incentive and voluntary programs are not enough. This person asks, what's the distinction between the voluntary incentive and pay for outcomes models? Aren't the pay for outcomes also voluntary? Is it just that traditional farm bill programs can't keep up with adoption needs?
I think we've heard random acts of conservation, right? So we're kind of scattershot of where we put practices, because that's the way traditional programs work. It's who comes into the door. The other side of this is that the process is slow. It can be slow depending on which state you're working in. So I could have 10 wetlands lined up, but it might take me 5 to 7 years to go through programs to implement those wetlands, just because the way those things work. Whereas if I'm going through pay for performance, I get selected because I have a good number for cost per pound of nitrogen. That could be all 10 projects, right?
Yeah.
And I will implement those as fast as possible, because I don't get paid until I've shown implementation and verification. So the carrot is there for me to be proactive, whereas through traditional programs, the carrot's not the same, because it's going through a program process with bureaucracy.
I guess the next one, do you think that in the long run, these pay for performance might be more cost effective for environmental benefits?
If they stay competitive, yes. Right. If it's a competitive program, then you're going to get to the best dollar per pound of nitrogen or phosphorus or whatever you're trying to get to. So it really goes back to the competitiveness of that program and having it being subscribed to, or you want it to be oversubscribed to by practitioners. So it needs to be an accessible program.
Okay. There's one here that kind of is asking about this payment, asking, is the reimbursement more or less equaling the cost of the project? Thinking, does a farmer reap any benefit above just getting reimbursed for the cost?
Yes. So that's the whole idea behind these pay for performance models, is that generally there's going to be some kind of incentive, generally a financial incentive. Yeah, I mean, it's basically, yes, that's the idea behind it.
And if that farmer can get it implemented at a pretty low cost and get a good payment for it, then they're going to have financial return greater than the cost they've outlaid.
Yep. And that works for either the farmer or for that financing institute that's doing it.
Yeah. And this, I guess, I think I know this one, but I'll ask it just so everybody's clear. Is how is the price set? Is it based on a true cost of N reduction, or I think it's based on what they bid for their cost?
It's a bid process, yeah. Yep. So it's basically, I can deliver this at this cost per pound of nitrogen reduced. So it's 100% a bid process.
Okay. Are there any easements attached to the larger pay for performance projects? For example, wetlands, do they have to stay on the landscape, or could the future landowner reverse the work and go back to less desirable practices?
So these models have a lot of flexibility. I know in Maryland's program, they don't stipulate easement language within what they have in the program. It's going to be in the interest of the implementer to secure an easement on that practice across at the minimum the contract length. And depending on the implementer, they might request it to be a permanent easement on that practice, and they might incentivize it that way.
Okay.
It's totally up to that implementer to figure out how that moves that bar for that landowner.
Okay. Okay, boy, getting a bunch of questions in here now. You mentioned, I think, Maryland DNR payments for habitat. Is that happening or just an idea?
That is just an idea, I believe, at the moment. Okay. They have done pay for performance for nitrogen and phosphorus in the past, but I don't think they've done habitat yet. But that is something that's, as we shift our focus because of that Caesar report to other goals within the Bay program, you could see once for habitat.
Okay. Next one is, can these payments be stacked with other private programs? If a farmer is getting paid for this program for N reduction, could they also enroll the same acre or practice for other private payments for carbon sequestration, for example?
Yes, if it's a different outcome.
Okay.
So I can't take, say, state cost share to implement a project, because when I use state cost share, they are claiming a portion of that nitrogen reduction through that program. So I can't take claim for that portion of it. But if they're not claiming, say, the carbon portion, then yes, you could enroll the other portion for carbon.
Okay. All right. I think that gets us through most of the questions here. And so again, if you need a CCA CEU, please email Elena Whitaker, ALENAW, at iastate.edu with your name, the name you entered to watch the webinar, and your CCA number. Please do that by 5 o'clock today. We also be tuning in for the webinar for next week on some agroforestry topics. There was, I guess, one last question here. Have you been developing a database of nutrient reductions per practice? Or kind of asking, elaborate on the variability of outcomes per practice?
I mean, internally, yes, we do, because even for grants, we do cost per pound of nitrogen reduced. For the state of Maryland, I'm sure they have their own database. And University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science put out a report in 2021, the detailed cost per pound of every single best management practice used in the Chesapeake Bay region. I can't remember the name of the report, but if you Google UMC's 2021 best management practices, Maryland Department of Environment, you'll get probably that paper.
Okay, great. With that, Tim, it's good to see you as always, even though virtually, and really want to thank you for the work that you're doing out east, and also thank you for sharing your work with our webinar attendees.
Yeah, thanks for the questions. Enjoyed it. Always good to see you, Matt. Hopefully I'll hear some more questions. Happy to take. If you have any questions, please email me. I think it was part of the slide. So.
Okay. Thanks so much, Tim. As I said, good to see you as always.
Yep. Thanks, everyone.